Well, greetings, friends and comrades, and happy Wednesday, October 2nd. I'm very pleased to have this conversation with a wonderful philosopher who's going to be joining me in a moment. But let me just say a few things at the outset. Uh, Deleuze, Gilles Deleuze, the great French philosopher, has in my work, in my program, been a constant point of reference. And I'm very pleased to have read this new book by Alex and bring him on to discuss it, Communism After Deleuze. You can check out some of my work in this area. If you examine my book, Psychoanalysis and the Politics of the Family, I have a whole section on Deleuze and Guattari's Anti-Oedipus. And the question regarding Deleuze and his influence on Marxism, his influence on contemporary socialism is, of course, I think a major question, a major point of tension. I will alert you to the debate and discussion I had with Catherine Liu, the author of Virtue Hoarders, she is a very strident and I think almost like uncompromising anti-Deleuzian. And that conversation was quite interesting because I ended up defending not defending Deleuze, but defending the idea that engaging with philosophers who are, in some cases, outside of the Marxist tradition, are reactionary is actually something that we as Marxists should do. So I'm not an easy anti-Deleuzian, but I will tell you that in all honesty, and I elaborate this in my book, Psychoanalysis, Politics of the Family. I've also written an article on micropolitics and the legacy of Deleuze and Guattari. I will tell you and I will confess that I have struggled with the way that Deleuzians have shaped some of the kind of core Marxist concepts, have really this is the heart, I think, of the question that we're going to have today with Alex, who's going to join me in a moment. So this is a question, I think, regarding not only the theoretical meaning of the left, sort of the legacy of 68, the legacy of French theory, but it's also an interrogation into how we fuse seemingly disparate discourses together. And it's also a question regarding perhaps the role of the socialist intellectual in how we conceptualize all of the important categories of the left, of socialism, etc. So we have a lot to discuss today. I now want to introduce our guest and bring him on. We are
Hello.
live streaming. Welcome to Alex Taek-Gwang Lee, who's coming at us from Seoul, South Korea. He is a philosopher and cultural critic and is the convener of a very important conference called the Idea of Communism Conference, which was, I think this was about 10 years ago.
Yeah, sure.
And you organized this in Seoul, brought Alain Badiou, Zizek, a bunch of other important philosophers together to talk about the meaning of communism in the 21st century. And this actually is at the heart of the conversation we are having today, because we are talking about your new
Mm.
book, which is entitled Communism After Deleuze. And it's published with Bloomsbury. I think I have a link to it in the show description. I just want to welcome comrades that are joining us. People can watch this after the stream. I'll just say on our YouTube page, YouTube has changed in recent times. So what I want you all to do is first like the video. That helps us get more views and attention to this very important topic. But I also wish for you to go to the subscribe button and to select reminders under the category of all, not personalized, but select all. If you enjoy the content that I put out, the videos, the interviews, the discussions, please do that. So Alex, first of all, welcome. And what time of day is it for you right now?
Yeah, it's 11:30. I'm very happy to be here, even though it's midnight, almost midnight.
Wow. Hopefully you were able to maybe take a rest before we.
Don't worry, I don't have any class, tomorrow.
Okay. Excellent to have you. I very much enjoyed your book. As I mentioned at the outset, Deleuze has become something of a scandal to the contemporary left. And
Mhm.
in my debate with Lou, it was very interesting because even though I was sort of highly critical of Deleuze, I noticed something happen, which was people tried to box me or categorize me as a quote unquote Deleuzian Marxist. And so immediately you have a sense that people have a fetish over the intellectual, whereby they think if you read, or if you take seriously a thinker, you must become them. You must sort of adopt their worldview, their concepts. Whereas my own position, Alex, and I want to ask you maybe to begin, is that we are in a theoretical crisis in some sense. And in fact, the debates regarding Marxism and post-Marxism have huge importance, in fact. The question as to what are theoretical points of influence, the thinkers that came in the wake of the 68 moment, this is still a debate that's a very important debate to have about the future of 21st century communism and the future of Marxist theory itself. So, who is Deleuze for you? And maybe in a general sense, and when did you first really engage with Deleuze's work, and what does he mean and represent to you as a philosopher?
So, good question is we would have many Deleuzes, in my opinion. So we would have American Deleuze, and then Japanese Deleuze, and then the English Deleuze, and then whoever there in French Deleuze, But for me, Deleuze is kind of a philosopher who didn't give up, the spirit of revolution, quite unlike Michel Foucault, because I read Michel Foucault first, and right after the graduation of my undergraduate course. So I got the bachelor degree, and then I was thinking of the postgraduate course, and I want to go to somewhere, not the Korea, because I was really disappointed by Korean situation those days, because end of revolutionary movement in 1990, and then all kind of that revolutionary spirit, it boiled down under the the cover of that kind of liberalism. Is a liberalism regarded as progress, progress idea. And then actually lots of the militant converted to liberalism in those days. Of course, that liberalism is a neoliberalism, is a global, coming along with global capitalism. So I really actually depressed in those days. So in library, I started to read actually the so-called post-structuralist, but in my opinion, that naming is really too much over exaggerated. What I mean, actually, I don't think there is some kind of some post-structuralism exists, because if we said the post-structuralism exists, we must call Lukács or some the Frankfurt School will be classified as post-structuralist. What is post-structuralism? What is structuralism? That is a really actually complicated debate. In my opinion, is structuralism is always rely on sort of some communication, the communication system. They try to build up the certain, communication system. In my opinion, socialism in one country aims at this kind of transparent, the communicative society. Now we are witnessing the return of this kind of idea in China. That is my thinking. So in those days, I didn't have this kind of idea, but I found out the later the Foucault is lost his spirit of revolution, and then of course he was really conservative, compared to other revolutionary philosopher in those days. But Deleuze didn't give up, and then Deleuze tried to find out certain reformulation of Marxism following Louis Althusser, because I studied Louis Althusser quite seriously in 1980, and Louis Althusser is kind of a master of a theory in the Korean militantism. That's why actually lots of students in those days, like and Korean 1980 in Korea, 1980s Korea, after the Gwangju uprising and the massacre, like the some the kind of some the residue of that long lasting 1968, what I mean, like May 1968. So we studied the the lots of some French text, in particular actually Althusser, because of structuralist, the Marxism. And then we gradually actually return to the original Marx text, because in those days the original Marx text was actually prohibited. It was actually illegal. If you read, the Marx, if you talk about the Marx, it was illegal. That's why we secretly, actually, the underground, the reading group, we organized that kind of Marx reading, and then that's 1980, and then we had lots of, the political group, the Stalin group, and then like, following the sort of Soviet Union, the official line, and then a Maoist, and then we are also pro North Korean, group. And then third one is a new left, is mostly actually they are reading actually this kind of French, the Marxism and French Maoism. But anyway, just we had many, political sector, but we experienced kind of disappointment and some surprise, some break with this kind of some revolutionary movement, with that collapse of the Soviet bloc. There was a really huge, the impact on our revolution. And then most of actually militant in those days turn into nowadays parliamentary member, just like that, is they turn into some politician, and then they want to be actually some more civil right, the activist or something like that. They try to find out a certain institution, to continue their movement towards some realize or actualize their own political idea or something like that. But I thought, that kind of choice, or that sort of opportunity to use your actually the career of a militantism, to be a sort of some the statesman, in any way, because actually we experienced that kind of democratization in those days. We had a lot of opportunity. If you want to be a statesman in those days, we said, you are militant and participate in this kind of some activity, because it's kind of some similar to the, some violent, the violent struggle. That means we using a Molotov cocktail, and then we actually the attacked, the police station, something like that. That thing happening, and then that's why actually America, sent us that famous Donald Gregg, who supervised, the killing of that Che Guevara in then, Bolivia. So they sent, this Donald Gregg, to Korea to control this situation. Really, really serious. And then, but suddenly, that situation is gone, with that event is a accidental, event, is a collapse of the Soviet Union. So, and then that's why actually I told you that I couldn't, give up my own experience, the devoting myself to the so-called, revolution. But like that's why actually I try to find out some kind of guideline, how to actually retain, or somehow to actually reformulate this kind of revolutionary movement, after this end of, the Soviet Union, or some kind of some try to find out the way to keep on this kind of communist movement. Of course, Antonio Negri really actually popular in those days. So I found Deleuze, the Deleuzian category, through this Antonio Negri's works. But in my opinion, Antonio Negri's work is really fantastic, but at some point quite militant, and then I was inspired by a lot, or I learned a lot from the Antonio Negri, but I wanted to find a more philosophical engagement into this kind of some kind of situation, is a neoliberal situation, whatever called, is a post, revolutionary the situation. So, and then I wanted to, make a kind of a theoretical engagement, because I was also influenced by Althusserianism. That's why I wanted to find out some theoretical engagement. So that's why I chose the Foucault, and I chose, the Deleuze, and then Deleuze and Guattari, Anti-Oedipus. So that was actually 1995. So right after I finished my bachelor degree, and then I was thinking, I started to read, Anti-Oedipus. In those days, we didn't have, proper translation. That's why I just ordered, the English translation, or some French, one is from the France, and then, the America, That's why actually I started to read, Deleuze in those days.
Thank you for that background. That's fascinating, and I would honor the fact that the left in South Korea,
Mhm.
culturally, in film in particular, has produced some
Sure, sure.
very, very remarkable um, products in terms of, especially on the level of the class consciousness. Of course, the Parasite film stands out
Sure.
as extremely
Yeah.
illustrative of this. Now, so that's fabulous. That's very interesting. I think it's a question now I want to move into is the question which would be, do you read Deleuze as having stages of thought,
Mhm.
politically speaking in particular? For example, you conclude by saying that the essay on the control societies from the
Mhm.
early 90s represents Deleuze at his most Marx oriented.
Mhm.
That seems to me to represent something like a shift, for
Mhm.
sure. Because why do I say that? Because I think that, a lot of young people read the Anti-Oedipus trilogy, Thousand Plateaus, What is Philosophy, and then the original, starting in the early 70s. And they A, decontextualize it, or B, they sort of assume that it's not a text which is trying to radically reform Freudian Marxism as well as Marxism proper. And this may be a point of disagreement between us, or maybe it's not, which is that my contention would be that the Anti-Oedipus series is in fact a very severe deformation of Marxist categories, and we can go through the categories that I find that they upend.
Mhm.
The main one being is that they, and Deleuze is very explicit about this in Anti-Oedipus, that in fact he wishes to put forward a foundation of desire
Mhm.
detethered from need.
Mhm.
And that is a bit elusive because at the same time they affirm that desire is productive. So, if you read the lectures, which are now translated into English and available online, you
Mhm.
can see exactly they are pushing against Marxism. The other area, of course, they're pushing against Marxism is in the conception of the state as a molar entity, which then leads to the theory of microfascism.
Mhm.
And that's a whole other conversation we can get into later in a moment. But perhaps first you might answer this question. Are there stages of Deleuze's political thought?
Mhm.
And how do you understand those stages? If this
Mhm.
is the right concept to describe what I'm getting at.
A really good question is, but in my opinion, the Deleuze Guattari didn't care about the readers. That's why, like, I don't know, it's quite in different sense, in my opinion. I don't know, believe in kind of some power of a text, but Deleuze and Guattari more rely on their own belief in the art, the experimental art is avant-garde in the spirit. So that's why they wrote those texts, according to their own, the belief in the experimental art. So that's why actually it caused lots of misunderstanding, the outside of a French context, in my opinion. So to my actually the impression, Anti-Oedipus is really, really, the French-oriented text. It's about the domestic politics. So if we don't have any, the knowledge about the kind of historical background, I think it might be quite, text would, lead us to quite misunderstanding. That means it might be quite easily misleading, and then from, the apolitical perspective, you could read, these and until quite different, different angle, from quite different angle. So that's what I want to say. But theoretically, if you are familiar with this kind of historical background, you would actually catch up what they try to argue in such a really really complicated or some artistic, artistically experimental text, because they try to create their own concept, like Walter Benjamin. Walter Benjamin created his own, the concept in his text. That's why it's not easy to follow, what he tried to argue there. But if you gradually follow that kind of the context of, the concept, which actually the proposed, those also, you could find out some trace. So in my opinion, Anti-Oedipus attempted to reformulate Marxism, the on the foundation of ontological, the condition. That means actually they try to introduce ontology into a Marxist, the practice or some Marxist thought. That is actually very crucial, actually, in my opinion, crucial, actually, the strategy to reformulate Marxism. Of course, actually, artists already did that, but the artists did really, actually, the successful actual achievement, but at the same time, he failed, to bring in, the how to reformulate the Marxist ontology. Then what is Marxist ontology? Marxist ontology is quite simple. The human being is what? Social being, It's very simple, but really, really complicated, the implication there. What I mean, actually, philosophically, really, really complicated. Because actually, the Lukács, also try to bring in this kind of ontological reformulation of Marxism in his later work, like labor. That is actually the Lukács' conclusion. The concept of labor for the Lukács really, really important, because actually before the Lukács, the official Marxism, even the orthodox Marxism, whatever called, lots of actual Marxists in those days, the followed the kind of some Hegelian sense of what is a historical development. In Hegelian sense, that means Hegelian perspective, which was internalized in the early Marxism or some later Marxism. Of course, Marx didn't finish in the Capital, so we don't know what kind of actual idea Marx tried to develop. But there are lots of actual concept is mixed in his works, all right? So in this sense, actually, the lots of people believe the contradiction. Even Mao had this idea contradiction, and then master slave, the dialectic. That means actual class struggle is definitely the reformulation of this kind of Hegelian the dialectic, right? So this class struggle and the contradiction is what is a motor engine of historical development. But Lukács, against this kind of orthodox Marxist understanding of Marxism, what propose different concept. What is labor? I think this idea is really, really actually the more actually elaborated through what the John Bellamy poster, and then so-called eco-Marxism. I think eco-Marxism is actually really, really actually elaborate this kind of Lukácsian idea, later Lukácsian idea of Marxism, labor, and then that actually the Marx, the provided two actual means of labor is two actually the means of life. First one is of course actually the what I mean actually the two means actually which was affiliated with labor. First one, the means of life, all right. This is actually the eco-Marxism is actually like a Saito Koei, and then developed their own theory of or their own reading of Marxism. The taking this the concept, it means of life, and then means of production. Actually, Marx, the divided these means into two categories, and then through this kind of an early Marx, what I mean like the Lukács really loved the early Marx, that is his own belief to revive the Marxism against that socialism in one country is more like in a diamet. Is more like a mechanistic, the approach to this kind of history. He tried to bring in, the philosophy into the Marxism again, right? That is, in my opinion, the later Lukács' the project. That's why, from this perspective, Lukács, actually formulate, was elaborate, the Marx, the concept of labor, and then he actually put in he revived the Marxism on this, the new foundation. His own, understanding of labor. That is his, the later works. But very similar. But actually and neoliberal. That means actually after the Second World War, so-called the late capitalism emerged. That is Adorno already pointed out. Is when they discussed the cultural industry. Right, the cultural industry actually replaced the kind of old, the mode of production. And then new actually the capitalism is emerged and then actually occupied, the world. And then what I mean actually the Deleuze Guattari in 1970 that they believe that the May 1968 is definitely symptomatic, the eruption of that kind of some resistance against that, the global capitalism. That's why they try to reformulate the Marxism like the Lukács, the through that kind of ontological, the ontological, project. That's why I just
Yeah.
told them the labor must be replaced with what? Desire, molecular,
Right.
some
Right.
assemblage. So why? Actually, capitalism changed. That is what they said. So labor already what? Part of this kind of capitalism as such. So labor is what Slavoj Žižek really jokingly actually pointed out this one. That actually, if you are a demand, we're gonna be a regular worker. What does that mean? You must exploit me actually regularly, not irregularly. That is a kind of some impasse of our critique, impasse of the leftist movement. And in my opinion, without this kind of ontological, the reflection on this the movement or some this kind of the new condition, we couldn't find out. We couldn't find out in the exit, to get out of this kind of system. That is what they discovered. That's why they needed, they needed actually the lots of the philosopher, which what the philosophers' ideas, which actually try to challenge this kind of the orthodox Marxism, or some even Lukács. Lukács tried to find out the solution in Hegel, young Hegel, but the really actually the Althusser and the Deleuze Guattari did is quite opposite to that one, anti-Hegelianism and then anti-humanism, because humanism is according to them is captured by capitalism. There's a human capital. So I think actually they try to push in this sense, the classical concept in Marxism. That's my interpretation.
I really appreciate that. It's very enlightening to analyze Deleuze and Guattari in this what you might call expansive way, because as you know, in the history of the left, we have polemics and we have theory, and I would make a strong distinction between them. For example, there is a Deleuzianism, an ism that emerges, which takes on certain characteristics, which come into discourse and conflict with the Marxist left, the socialist left, and this often ends up becoming an ideological struggle. So, for example, today many Deleuzians tend to be kind of anarchist-oriented, liberal, libertarian-oriented, and they would presumably reject the idea that Lukács could be of value as a philosopher because they have a naive idea of Stalinism. They think that Stalinism is some skyhook mystical father problem. It's total ridiculous. But what you're talking about is the later Lukács, which again, the Deleuzians think is something that it's not, in his project called the Ontology of Social Being. And what you're saying is quite profound, that they are superimposing desire as the basis for a new ontology for the left, for politics. You also contend that this new ontology is not reducible to liberalism. My own view differs from you, maybe, and this is what I want to talk about now, in the sense that because they are attacking the edifice of Marxism, and as I mentioned before, they are putting forward this kind of fluid conception of subjectivity. They're putting forward this idea of the rhizomatic. They're putting forward this idea of the molecular and the molar. And they're putting forward this idea that to identify with institutions that are centralized, in some sense, they are putting forward an extreme anti-bureaucratic version of the left. And this, I think, has some downsides, insofar as, for me, the left needs to be about building organization. We do need to address the question of the state. We do need to not fall into what I would consider the conclusion from this position being a kind of utopianism. even the fact that Charles Fourier becomes the primary socialist exemplar, but Marx was very, very opposed to that utopian thread
Sure.
in some sense. So that's one question I have for you, right? Which is, how do you theorize this question between theory and polemic, the way that we maybe should avoid the making of a thinker into an ism? Because again, the trajectory of Deleuze's thought is towards a rapprochement with Marx. But a lot of young people read Anti-Oedipus and they forget that there was no interest in a rapprochement with Marx there. They were interested in something more avant-garde, more experimental, with breaking up Marxism in some sense. Even though, well, I'll stop there and maybe gather your thoughts. I could say more, but please.
So, yeah, we should actually define, the liberalism first. Anyways, thank you for that challenge. In my opinion, the liberalism is a certain, historical byproduct. And Foucault said, liberalism is not ideology; it's a kind of technique of governance. It's a governmentality. All right. That's why actually the liberalism must be understood. Certain, actually the theory of governance. That's actually I'm thinking. So and then, but it's John Locke, that established this theory. The Lockeanism is if we said liberalism ideology, I think I could say Lockeanism. And then John Locke is a really, really extreme rationality. That means actually the worship of the really, really actually super rationality there. The Lukács, developed in the destruction of reason. The very, very interesting concept, what is super rationality. And then he didn't directly, apply this concept for explaining the socialism in one country. He didn't. The diamet, he didn't. But actually, everybody would know that. What actually that concept indicates. In my opinion, today's Trumpism is like that. Is the Trump the Lukács used irrationalism, but the irrationalism definitely at some point is super rationality.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That is actually what the Deleuze emphasize. Why? They said that is the meaning of the state. So for them, all kind of state is despotic machine. There is no any liberal government. There is no, the certain human-faced, liberalism. It's all actually this kind of state, according to them, despotic power. And then this state is not, the historical byproduct. That is their point. I really actually fascinated by this discussion. That's why I really into the Deleuzian Guattari. When I read the 8,000 Plato, right? So this is really interesting. So and the Urstadt is their concept, and then they quoted a lot, the Peter Vogel's work is Oriental despotism, and then they actually smashed the Hegelian the approach to history. The Hegel defined China as a kind of despotic country, and then more actually primitive the political regime than the Europe. Is the beginning of Eurocentrism, something like that. Actually, they smashed it. It doesn't mean that they rejected the Hegel. I don't think so. It's because Hegel developed lots of concept which actually adapted by Deleuze and Guattari. So they actually changed the actually traditional understanding of state. That is their point. They never criticized the Soviet Union. You couldn't find any evidence. Even Guattari didn't canceled the democratic centralism. What they said is that democratic centralism cannot actually embrace that struggles across the world, in particular the third world. Is Algerian war actually gave them that kind of insight. So, in my opinion, they didn't go against the actually existing socialism. but they wanted to push this socialism toward further. But of course, 1970, you would know that history actually went to the different direction, different direction they wanted, all right? So actually lots of defeat, the Portugal, the Italy, and then they actually lots of complicit, the policy, and then they turn into, as the what happened in the South Korea, is a liberal, the liberal actually, the defender, they try to find out some kind of a mixture, between socialism and the liberalism. There might be some rise of, they might be actually promote that kind of rise of liberalism, the new liberalism, in my opinion, is 1980, something like that. So in this sense, the point or some, if you said, the any contribution from Deleuze Guattari for this kind of new stage of Marxism, or some to the kind of a weapon, they try to reformulate Marxism as a weapon. I think actually their understanding or their reconceptualization state, against the Engels, the Engels, formulation of a state. Paul Engels, because Engels, learn this concept from the what is that? Is the
Morgan.
the Louis Henry Morgan.
Yeah.
And then he actually wrote in a very famous book, the origin of the family and the private, the property and the state. And then actually the never changed since that Engels, the proposition of a state. But they changed this idea, and then they invented a really, really actually, the interesting idea of state. A state is just Urstadt, nothing to do with the historical development. It's not actually, the culmination of this kind of historical development, because the state is always there. That is actually the evidence of this kind of, the argument, or some evidence to support this kind of argument is what? Oriental despotism. So actually, really actually logical, the logical actually, discussion there, the why we shouldn't, regard the state as what? Certain, the more developed, the apparatus, but rather kind of the apparatus will capture. So our life is always prior to, but this concept is not just, the vitalist concept, that, the Lukács criticized, in terms of relationalism. But that's why I said, in my book, the Deleuze corrected vitalism, as the Marx did, to the Hegel. So actually, he corrected vitalism from the angle of a Marx concept of actually what? The means of life, right? This is because actually Marx, already defined, the human being as a social being, and then this social being does not exist without what? Without the inorganic body. So an inorganic body is transformed into, many interpretation possible, but transformed into their own concept, body without organ. That is really, really actually of course, body without organ is a more expanded concept than the organic body, because it already embraced subject and object together. It's quite different from the object-oriented ontology. It's quite different from that. It's already our subject is produced through this kind of agencement. Is the machinic arrangement. That means the life is already there, and then this interdependency produced our subjectivity. So what should we do, for the revolutionary actually movement? Of course, yes. They said, another thing is very interesting. The interestingly actually, argued by the Deleuze is that revolution is always necessary. But what I mean actually, the revolution is the taking place every time. We don't take it. We don't take the revolution, and then everybody knows revolution fails, but we keep saying revolution must fail, something like that. So that means actually life as such, according to Deleuze and Guattari, life as such is revolutionary, but we don't want to let our life go this direction. That's why everybody wants to be fascist rather than revolutionary. And then this is really insightful, the argument, in my opinion. So that is the reason why I don't think actually the Deleuze and Guattari project is what? liberal or any the defense of libertarianism or anarchism. But of course, actually, they would read Deleuze in such a way, we would say that might be a misunderstanding, but they preserve that kind of possibility of reading. Possibility of reading. Actually, there might be their limit, but in my opinion, we need to actually read Deleuze, in this sense, from the perspective of communism. That is more important. That is what I'm talking about. We can read Deleuze as a liberal philosopher, but in my opinion, you can even read Deleuze or Guattari as communist philosopher. And which one is more revolutionary? That's
I'm thinking, in a sense, you have Andrew Culp, who proposes dark Deleuze, which would be a Deleuze that's capable of not being appropriated by the kind of affirmative Silicon Valley tech kind of fluid idea of assemblages and sort of this kind of embrace of a kind of pro-liberal, pro-capitalist, libertarian, left-wing Nietzscheanism. I think that Culp's solution, though, at the same time does end up fusing anarchism with communism. And this becomes a challenge for me because, again, the Deleuzian perspective has such a strong antipathy to centralized organization and to this critique of democratic centralism a la Lenin. So that's important, which is they are responding to Lenin. They are responding to Bolshevism. Everyone knows, or if you don't know, you should know, that Guattari had Trotskyist roots.
Sure.
That's important. That doesn't necessarily exonerate these theoretical choices from capture by anarchist liberalism, in my opinion. One question I have is now turning to the question of how they theorize fascism and the notion of microfascism, because I would contend that implicit in this formulation is, as you say, a type of celebration of minority struggles, third worldism, but also, and here is where I see the danger, is that we are effectively getting a labor aristocracy theory on top of that. Here's the problem that I have, and I'm speaking very locally to the Western regions, is that I think that a lot of interpreters that embrace the Deleuze, and even Foucault, of course, wrote about this as well, microfascism is something he embraced. And I want your thoughts on this. Does it not shut down this idea of the working class as almost an impossible subject, or a subject which is so prone to microfascism that we cannot organize it? And then even worse, Marxists that theorize the centrality of working class in an age of liberal reaction such as our own are accused of complicity with some microfascism. So I have been of the view that the microfascism thesis has been a stumbling block to practical organization of the working class in the core regions. And at worst, and this is where liberalism is inextricable here, it then could result in the fetishization of minority struggles, which academia loves to embrace in a very pandering way, right? In a very terrible way. And that actually, paradoxically, as Michel Clouscard argues, produces fascism. So what they critique as fascism ends up producing fascism. But they disavow the fact that they have been a causal agent in that production. So that's a struggle for me. That's a struggle for me, the fascism question, because, and we don't need to get into sort of how we qualify the new right as fascist, although if you're interested, we can. I don't want to say that there is no such thing as fascism. I don't want to say that. But nor do I want to be so loose. And I fear that some interpreters have been very loose in their understanding here. Would you agree, and please push back if you disagree?
All right, that's a good question. So I think actually, if we use the Deleuze today, I think that the Brian Massumi had published the couple of books now. So I didn't finish it, but I couldn't, put some comment on it. But I gonna write, some review over that. But thing is that actually one of the another political contribution to today's situation, the front of the kind of the Deleuze-Guattari's the works might be their analysis of fascism. So their point is quite the clear. They said capitalism is what? Capitalism is incubator of fascism. So they said actually the philosophy is the only way to resist this actually everybody the desire to be fascist. So this idea is from, of course, as you know that Spinoza, why people the want servitude as if it is salvation. That's what Spinoza said. And then Deleuze-Guattari repeated this the statement is many times. And then that is what today's the disease according to capitalism. Capitalism actually captured our desire, and then they actually what? That is actually, in my opinion, more elaborate form of Lukács sense of reification, or some Marxist term of the Fascism, But actually, of course, Hegelian Marxists, the developed, the concept of alienation, from this the concept. But the Deleuze-Guattari is more actually took the affirmative, affirmative like a body, the affirmative, multiplicity is there. The multiplicity is life. And then, so actually, this capturing machine is of course, capitalism, also the driving, this capturing machine to what? Toward their own the economic profit, right? So actually, this capitalism is a kind of a mechanism, and then through this kind of actual mechanization, we are easily fallen into this kind of desire toward servitude rather than liberation. That's why I say. So even revolutionary spirit, this kind of energy, what is actually captured by this capitalist economy. So that is a really, really important point. But in 1970, nobody actually said the fascism is what? Is a consequence of capitalism. In those days, people believed that liberalism is alongside with this kind of capitalism. And liberalism is actually a theory of capitalism. A lot of people believe that. That's why Foucault said, there is no philosophy in the liberalism. A political economy is a liberal, philosophy. That's what Foucault said. In similar way, and Deleuze-Guattari said, capitalism is nothing to do with liberalism. That means nothing to do with that kind of theory of governance. And then this capitalism is the really, really actually the way in which the what is the fascism is comes to exist. And then today Trumpism showed that. Everybody actually discussed over this issue whether Trump is a fascist or not. But why he's doing is a fascist? Why? He's simply saying, I'm gonna actually, revive the American capitalism. But what he's doing is that, and his supporters, the doing is definitely what? The revival of fascism. That is what I mean. So, and then their actual argument gained lots of some the support, in my opinion. So recent, the fascist study, you would see that in the journal of fascist study, and then fascism study, and then they actually adopted this idea. And then now actually I know actually that I follow this the development of this research, the trend. And then now that actually some research, the focused on this kind of relation between capitalism and then fascism. So that is one point. Another one is okay, just I really loved the Lukács's critique of Nietzsche, and then your critique of Nietzscheism, even some kind of Deleuzeism, which was in my opinion corrupted by the Nietzschean the position. But I don't think actually the Deleuze was really serious about Nietzsche, because his book, Nietzsche and Philosophy, just a textbook for the baccalaureate, the exam. So he wrote that actually the book for the what is a student in the high school. So, and then who actually revived Nietzsche, crucially, is George Bataille. George Bataille revived. And he actually rescued Nietzsche from the fascism, and he criticized what? the sister's version of will to power, all right? And he revived and he tried to restore the Nietzsche as a very important, the philosopher in the history of philosophy. But I don't think Deleuze, followed that way, because Deleuze, I don't think, Deleuze is, the supported, Deleuze supported the irrationalism. He tried to reformulate, the rationality as such, that is his vitalism, what I mean. So he didn't support, that kind of mysticism. He didn't support, that kind of a superstition or some kind of some very, classical sense of vitalism, spiritualism, something like. He didn't, go there. More like he took, the Bergson, and then he said, Bergson is a secular metaphysician, right? And then there is a material. He tried to bring in that kind of the Bergsonian materialism, because in those days he talked about the Bergsonian Marxism, the African, the communist, the socialist, the adapted, Bergson to actually develop their own Marxist practice, against what? France, the French, Marxism, something like that. So anyway, I didn't know actually whether Deleuze, the recognized, that kind of Bergson Marxism in Africa.
I let me just say briefly about a couple points on this. I think that to the extent that the Anti-Oedipus series is a Nietzschean project, the category of life is incorporated and inspired by a general problematic that Nietzsche gives to philosophy on the one hand. On the other hand, I think where Deleuze's Nietzscheanism is most interesting is in the ethical book, I consider an ethical book called Logic of Sense, where that's where you get a very, I think, compelling treatment of resentment and its effect on the body and on conscience that Deleuze is trying to work through in a very rigorous way. But that's not immediately political, in my opinion. And I'm not sure that that qualifies. Now, however, I would say that the general incorporation of Nietzscheanism within the spirit of 68 has, especially because we know that Foucault and Deleuze were sort of supervisors of the translation project of Nietzsche's Nachlass, and that this translation process had a very particular political bent, which was funneled into the reformation of Marxism itself. So from a general perspective, left-wing Nietzscheanism, I think, is still at this moment something that was used as a weapon to abolish Marxism as it really existed at the time, and for which I'm highly critical. And as I say in my book, I think we can separate Deleuze out. I think at the same time, the reference you made to Nietzsche and philosophy as a book is very interesting. That sometimes in the West, the books by these French philosophers that are meant for, like I'm thinking of Badiou's book, which was meant for high school students, called Ethics, was his most popular in the West. Same with this one. Although on that point, I think the problem I have there is what you get into is a kind of a black hole of Nietzscheanism, where left-wing Nietzscheanism thinks falsely that they can restore Nietzsche as a left-wing figure authentically against the right-wing perversion of his thought. I don't think that project has legs, in the sense that if you go through and you try to revise all of the core concepts, including Ressentiment or Übermensch and Will to Power, I believe, and I think Lukács is correct about this, philosophically, even metaphysically, I believe that still Nietzsche is a right-wing epistemologist. His epistemology is still right-wing, in my opinion. I'm very happy to hear that you look fondly on Lukács' work, especially Destruction of Reason and his later work. Could you say something maybe a little bit more about that? Because I know you've been reading a lot of Lukács. And it is, as a side point, before you talk about Lukács more, don't you think it's kind of a tragedy that Lukács is not much invoked in this milieu of the French thinkers that we're talking about? Even though they read him, he still is not a name that is wrestled with.
Sure.
because they were raised in the 30s to really debate history class consciousness very much. And then I think there was this question about whether Lukács becomes Stalinist. I think it's not exactly true that he becomes sort of fundamentally
No,
changed.
no,
I don't think so. So anyways, but you had mentioned that you had proposed something, and I want everyone listening to recognize that this is very, very powerful, because what you're helping us do is sort of de-polemicize the history of thinkers so that we can put them to work. Because again, the polemics end up paralyzing us on the left, and we then think, well, you can't talk about Lukács with Deleuze. And you're saying, no, you should, and you can. That's a very, very powerful point, because you're opening up with something. You're not closing it down. So say more about Lukács for you. And of course, even your criticisms as well would be welcome. I know you've recently written about this on your Substack as well.
Really, really, yeah, the hilarious question. So, yeah, I like Lukács very well. I like the Lukács much, because he's a quite honest guy. He's a very honest guy. Even though he did lots of wrongdoing, he did, but he accepted, his mistake, in his later interview. So his later interview is really, really actually important if you understand his root. And then another thing is that he didn't choose, even he was Jewish, and then he expected the rise of fascism, the traveling to America, the United States. He didn't go to the United States, and he went to the Soviet Union, right, Russia. And then he would expect, what kind of thing gonna wait for him. So he went there, and then the task was there in the Moscow to actually the archive, the Marx and Engels the works, his manuscript. That's what he found. He discovered that the economic and the philosophy manuscript in the 1844, and that inspired him a lot. And then he changed his mind. So he decided to rediscover his early, the research on the Hegel. So that is the reason why he wrote, the Jungen Hegel, is a young Hegel. So, but you should actually understand, the Lukács's, purpose when he wrote that book. It's not just, the book titled The Young Hegel. He tried to revive, young Hegel against what? Against later Hegel. What is later Hegel? Later Hegel was adopted by, in those days, Soviet Union, to justify that socialism in one country. Because later Hegel, that the Hegel wrote a strange article, right before his death, the English Reform Bill. And there Hegel, talked about, socialist vision of a state, the mediation, that means actually he actually argued there, Hegel argued there, so the state should mediate private interest, toward, that kind of some public interest. I think actually the socialism in one country definitely adopted this idea, but in such a, atmosphere, such a really, really actually, the restrictive ambience, the Lukács chose young Hegel rather than, later Hegel. That is really symptomatic in my opinion, because as you know, actually that book is definitely the Lukács's, dissertation, PhD dissertation. So he wrote that one, and then he gradually disillusioned from Soviet Union, the actually existing socialism. And then, of course, the crucial moment is what is a failure of that Hungarian Revolution. All right, and then he was actually secluded, within his, the apartment. He couldn't get out. Definitely his, any writing about politics is prohibited. That's why he started to write. The Frank Jameson beautifully actually described this, how the the literary critic, there was literary actually criticism function as kind of political activity. So he actually started to write about that, the literary criticism, during his the prison, the prison within his home, his home. But in my opinion, then 1970, he would the observed the defeat of that kind of a revolution movement, and then the decline of socialism, across the world. And then he actually he proposed a very interesting idea in his interview. The lots of actually, he was really critical of French, Marxism and French Maoism, something like that. But in later, interview, he actually really showed a changed attitude toward that. It's a new social movement. And then he actually said, now the condition of capitalism changed. That means actually reality changed, and then the movement must be changed. That is what the Lukács developed in terms of realism. So, but another actually interesting point I would emphasize here is that later Lukács, after that kind of the failure of Hungarian revolution, and then he actually was gradually moving toward another the non-Marxist philosophers. One of them is Nikolai Hartmann, and then very strangely he adopted the concept, the will to ethics. And then he actually used that term, his later, works, including, the ontology of a social being. So that's why he turned, he turned his, attitude from the philosophy of negation to the philosophy of affirmation, like, the Badiou and then, Deleuze and Guattari. So he criticized, Nietzsche, but he adopted this kind of Kantian concept, will to ethics, and he slightly changed it, will to reality. Will to reality. And then that is really, really resonated his, the literary criticism, realism. All right. So, and then this is really interesting. And then quite a similar, actually, the idea to the passion toward the real,
Sure.
And then through this kind of the angle, changed the angle, he developed, but he didn't finish, the new ontology of social being. He had same idea with, the Althusser and, his followers, to reformulate the Marxism in the new condition of capitalism. But he didn't finish it.
It's very powerful because the objective was that the ontology of social being was meant to be a prolegomena to an ethics.
It was influenced onto the French, Marxism, after the 1968.
Well, you remember he wrote a book when he first became Bolshevik called Tactics and Ethics. Okay. I would contend, and here he's dealing with the question of revolutionary violence primarily. And a big thing with Stalinism, of course, was the ontology of the social being of the class of petty bourgeoisie. Did this make them eligible for execution or not? These are the questions Lukács is trying to figure out. And I think that at times he's torn. It's a real aporia. It's a real question, philosophical question. And I think that this draws me to my next question for you regarding Deleuze's concept of the proletariat and the notion that many people have written about, which is that the people are missing. And this idea is very interesting because it's developed in his reflections on third world cinema. And one question I have, and it's going to be posed as critical. Okay, so if the proletariat is understood in this kind of latent or almost invisible sense to the system of production, how do we think about class subjectivity? in this Deleuzian register.
Mhm.
Because what I worry is that we end up having a problem, which we can only see now as a problem in our present, which maybe wasn't so apparent in the 70s.
Mhm.
Because in the 70s, they were looking for a new revolutionary subject. Because the working class was thought to have become static and non-dialectical as an agent.
Mhm.
Now we see that liberalism, neoliberal era, the centrist parties, etc., especially the Democratic Party in the United States, they're very adept at uh, capturing in a very paternalistic way
Mhm.
any immediate sign of revolt or kind of
Mhm.
so this category then becomes something we now have to further question of this notion of the proletariat as Deleuze theorizes. So let me both invite you to define how he thinks this,
Mhm.
what you find valuable in it, its connection to the third world question, but also to my problem, if you might, which is, are we thinking revolt of subjectivity so detethered from class as a relation of exploitation connected to modes of production?
Mhm.
Because if we are, I see a problem from in my view.
All right. Also, quite crucial question, because in my opinion, the Marxism is arose in the European context. All right. So the Europe had a working class. What about the so-called rest of the world in the 19th century, 20th century? All right. And then later Marx, recognized this one. That's why he wrote, such a letter to the Jesuits. The many communism will be possible.
The
All right.
Russian
Yeah,
commune.
yeah, Russian commune. The actually there are also a lot of is not misunderstanding, many interpretation. Sorry, is a many interpretation about the what the Marx said in the letter. But my interpretation is that the Marx the acknowledge that fact. Many communism will be possible because actually in Gotha, the critique of Gotha program, I think that the pamphlet is really important. Because actually there Marx is separated the communism from socialism. I think we would say the today China is a socialist country, but not communism. The socialism without communism has no actual distinction with the capitalism, right? That is my own understanding. So there actually Marx the define the communism as what is really actually the thing of desire. He said, the from each according to ability, you know, and that to each according to their needs. That means from their ability we produce, and then this actually the product should be distributed to or so according to what is their needs. Is desire. But if you actually the reverse this the flow from your needs to the ability, there might be fascism. So that is actually I think really important. That's why actually the communism is a really important idea.
That's the question that Michel Kluskard,
Mhm.
that many Marxist critics of Deleuze and Guattari, and even of Freudian Marxism writ large,
Mhm.
have raised, which is that the conflation of need with desire, according to Michel Kluskard, becomes the site of a new neo-Kantian dualism, which is unresolved in the anti-Oedipus series, and at worst results in a reformulation of the left in which economic need is deprioritized in our understanding of the revolutionary subject.
Mhm.
So economic categories move away.
Mhm.
Now, in post 2008 world in which we all live, where capitalism is now in this punitive, post neoliberal,
Mhm.
brutal, quasi fascist situation,
Mhm.
it seems to me that a left that has usurped economic need is in bad
Mhm.
condition.
Mhm. So actually
Would you agree?
yeah, actually partly agree. But when the Deleuze and Guattari use this term desire, it's not like the Freudian sense. The Freud actually developed his theory based on the thermodynamic, the science. But Deleuze is really, really critical of this thermodynamic, the physics. If you read in a different repetition, he actually the attack, and then he emphasized the asymmetrical relation, the kind of thermodynamic representation, and then the energy, that is what he tried to say. So he already actually preserved that kind of possibility of later theory there, and then that's why he tried to the replaced contradiction, the concept of contradiction with what? Repetition. That's why he needed, Nietzsche. I don't think actually he was Nietzschean when he quoted Nietzsche there, because he quoted many, the philosopher. You should know that actually he always bring, together Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. And the Kierkegaard is more influential on the, Deleuze, because at the later Deleuze keep talking about, if you want to create the new world, you must believe in the world first. It's really actually the kind of some variation on Alain Badiou's, the concept. If you want to create the actual new subject, you must believe in, you must affirm the subject first, just like that. So this is a philosophy of affirmation. So that's why actually they found out that kind of heretic, the philosopher, against that kind of some philosophy of negation, which was mainstream in those days. That's why I think, in my opinion, he chose, this so-called irrational, the Nietzsche, or some irrational, Kierkegaard, defined by the Lukács. But anyway, in those Lukács also regarded as the orthodox Marxist, something like that. So, but anyway, just from this perspective, I would say what they try to say in terms of invention of people or invention of proletariat really related to this idea. They didn't say desire is liberation. That the concept of desire is a little bit similar to Foucault's concept of knowledge, knowledge and power, just like that. So desire always what? Captured by capitalism. So which one is prior to this desire? That is their question. As you said, I really agree with that, Daniel. You said, the kind of desire or something ontological, the interpretation of life is not political. It's not political. Ontology is not political one. Is Carl Schmitt already discussed this one, So, but this, the apolitical dimension defined or some determined politics. That is their point. So desire is determined by this apolitical life. That's why we should change this apolitical dimension of life. This is agencement. This is assemblage. So we must actually get into this system and implode this system. That is immanent critique. So this is the only way we can resist fascism. Otherwise, everybody wanted to be a fascist because they want to actualize their desire, which was already captured by capitalism. So desire is given by capitalism. All right. So this is, in my opinion. So partly I agree, the glass card, but the thing is that, but his discussion about this situation really, really too much French oriented, in my opinion.
Yeah, very French, right?
Yeah.
Yes, because he has the view that Deleuze emerges as a very particular, and you talk about this too, social position of the philosopher,
Sure.
which is not a philosopher of the Communist Party, but in fact representing what you might call the kind of neutral state philosopher in a paradoxical sense, even though Deleuze is a profound critic of the state. And he uses this idea of Kant's three critiques as putting forward three different types of intellectuals. One is a encyclopedic intellectual. The second is an intellectual which is technical, a practical reason, so pure reason, practical reason. And then third is critique of judgment, which is the intellectual of the sublime, of the avant-garde, of the experimental. And they are Deleuze, represents this type of state intellectual,
Right.
which is a sublime intellectual for whom the subject of liberation, the schizoid subject,
Yeah.
is, and now this I think is very interesting to connect to Lukács, is aristocratic in their epistemology. And what does Badiou call Deleuze in his book Clamor of Being? An aristocratic philosopher. In what sense? Well, in a sense that the power of this intellectual as a surrogate state philosopher has just as much power as the proletarian party. And this is actually an interesting point regarding the question I want you to think or to respond to, perhaps, is would you affirm that Deleuze is, like, what is his relationship to this category of aristocratic, would you say? And also, I think that in the early anti-Oedipus, the schizophrenic subject is in Thousand Plateaus. They sort of rein in what the intensity they assign to the schizoid subject as liberatory. But again, to me, that schizoid subject as a liberated subject, the point that Kluskart is identifying, I think, is correct, which is that intrinsically, its epistemology will have a difficulty to connect to common knowledge, to the people. Because in a sense, it's a sublime artist who pretends to knowledge of the noumenon, knowledge of the unknowable. And they then risk this problem of fetishizing that. I find that very convincing, and I wonder what you think, especially on whether Deleuze can be seen as aristocratic or not, and how that might be.
Yeah, that is not just the question about Deleuze and Guattari, but all kind of philosopher and writer, because as Jacques Rancière said, who is a writer in modern society? Those people who writing, their work for those who do not read their works. So I think this is dilemma of modernism, So in this sense, actually, in my opinion, anti-Oedipus really, I already discussed it, the really French-oriented, the issue. They dealt with actually this French, the oriented, French-centered issue. So outside of, the France, not many people could actually, understand what they try to say. But that is always in there. Is a kind of the discrepancy between the intellectual and then, this the so-called the mass or some public or some people. But that's why actually Deleuze also discuss it when he, mentioned Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, and then he also talk about the private, the intellectual, private writer, and then that is a really important because there's opposite concept to what we understand in terms of private, writer. Is private writer is more like, as you said, it might be called some aristocratic, because they pursue their own singularity. The ignoring the outside, the some respond, that is might be called aristocrat. But even the any people outside of this the some media would call you and call me and then just aristocratic intellectual. They try to preach us, but that is what I would say fascist strategy. Trump actually really the example, how they use this kind of some aristocratic, the critique of aristocracy to what is the cancelled, that kind of philosophical critique. So in this sense, the Deleuze trusted, the power of a philosophy, unlike Foucault. Foucault was, anti-philosopher, and Lacan was an anti-philosopher. That's why Jacques Lacan tried to practice, psychoanalysis, and Foucault actually went to the history, genealogy, more actually the public, the more popular, work. He tried to produce it, and then but Deleuze's position is quite different. He wrote very typical text, and then he said, our task is to create actually the people who are missing. That means that is our task. That is a philosophical task. So if you are a philosopher, you should do that. And then, in my opinion, this idea is really, really resonated with Lenin's, the pamphlet. I wrote an article about this. Lenin Unfinished. I wrote an article about this one. Is Lenin's, what is to be done? Is Lenin's Bolshevism. So, I sometimes I told my friend, the Deleuze-Guattari would be Leninist,
So what do you make in Marxist sense that do you have a licensing for a adventurism of a redefinition of the proletariat, which would risk a kind of conception of a proletariat as maybe too immediatist in the sense of any revolt we could see as a new people? Would this pose a risk? Because this to me was one of the challenges that I have even with the legacy of Althusser. You reference Isabel Garo in your book, and she has a very powerful critique. And because why is she important? She's important because she reminds us that Foucault and Deleuze, that their understanding of Marxism came through Althusser. And she shows that there have been, in fact, some consequences of the Althusserian Marxism in let's say, his children. Could this be one of them? Now, I can see that for third world struggles, perhaps maybe there's something quite useful in this theorization. But do you understand my reservations? And what would you say to them? In other words, at a moment in which the left needs to find a way to truly politicize the working class and organize the working class for strategic reasons, not for moral reasons, right? Not for moral reasons. Because it's a bit of a paradox. If philosophically the politics of Deleuze is anti-Hobbesian state, and also anti-Rousseau, because, this distinction between Hobbes and Rousseau is very important. But he's anti-Rousseau in the sense that he does not want to appeal to the common status of the people. But what is the value of the people are missing, where he says that they can be identified in the non-representational elements of the nation state? How do we understand this non-representational? What exactly is this? What is this referring to? To me, it feels vague. Your thoughts?
So, good question. So, but your question is really tricky because you already presuppose, working class exists, working class exists. So,
sociologically, yes, I think actually this is important. I would contend that we do have to face some empirical sociological fact of the working class. Now, you could push back on that, and I would invite you to do so.
But thing is that just according to Marx, right? Just is a working class or the proletariat is the grave digger of capitalism. But think about how many people on this earth, could be called the working class. Those people living in the Bangladesh, I didn't see any working class. I would see the workers, right? But even they belong to the actual Islamic economy. We actually quite naturally discuss the capitalism, and then neoliberal capitalism. But the many population on this earth belong to quite a different economic sector. That is exactly what the Foucault discovered in the actually the Iran 1970. The actually evolutionary decline in Europe, and he found certain different place in which he actually I don't know whether he found out some hope there, but Islamic economy quite that had a different logic different logic from the, as we know, is a neoliberal capitalism. Of course, it does not exist without actually this neoliberal capitalism. But anyway, actually they had a different logic of finance, the different the logic of capital. So what I mean actually, this is exactly Deleuze-Guattari tried to say. we simply said, the some kind of united, the working class. But thing is that the working class exists as a really, really at a singular way. And then from this perspective, we need to invent, this working class first. And then how can you do that? They didn't say anything. That's why they didn't follow this kind of elitism, you know. It's more like a decentralized. This I love this, my own term is a decentralized Bolshevism. So, what is decentralized Bolshevism? Actually, we each, people could be the Bolshevik. It's like a private intellectual. So that is a subjectivity, and that subjectivity cannot be represented by any media. That is what the reason why the Guattari talk about the post media, right? So nowadays, actually, media is really powerful to represent this kind of some group in the social media, but something singular one cannot be actually represented by this machine and by this the capitalist the economy. All right. So this is exactly what I want to say. So actually we should create a certain the singularity which cannot be captured by state. That is, in my opinion, their own idea, because actually for them revolution is necessary. That means because this state and then this capitalism imposed their own law on us. But there is always a symmetrical relation between this law and our practice, because the law doesn't have any experience, like today's AI. It doesn't have any experience. That means the law is just a declare, as the Trump does at the moment. He declared that, and he just check out how actually this laws works out, and then it caused in certain turmoil, whatever, and then they actually adjust their law. That is what Deleuze talk about in the I think one of his masterpieces is a logic of sense. So law is imposed on us without any experience. So in this sense, revolution is necessary. We must resist it, or we would resist it, necessarily. So, and then in this sense, what is the important thing is, of course, the revolutionary subjectivity, and then this subjectivity could be produced by this rearrangement of living, the dimension. It means a political, dimension of life. This means of labor, or means of life. This is important.
I think this is very, very fascinating. Well, I'm not sure that we will fully find solidarity on this point regarding class, because as I've mentioned in the article that I shared with you on anti-Oedipus that I wrote and published a few years ago, it was Sartre's move in Critique of Dialectical Reason to conceptualize a new revolutionary subject beyond the category of classes. And I feel that this constitutes a lot of interesting insights, but I'm not sure that it is the best model for historical materialism. Precisely because because I agree with Lukács's point in History and Class Consciousness about dialectic of in itself and for itself, which, of course, I think in the general Althusserian abandonment of Hegel, we no longer think that conception, and I think that perhaps philosophically that is a deficit of the anti-Hegelianism. But on to that question, I wanted to ask you a couple of points. You identify the concept of disjunctive synthesis as perhaps the most important Deleuzian concept. And I wanted to invite you to maybe say something about that. You talk about how, in fact, it represents the combination of Marx and Nietzsche for him.
All right.
How does this work for you, and what do you see as like its particular value?
So, in my own reading, real enemy of Deleuze is Kant, not Hegel. He actually really actually the critical of Kant, Immanuel Kant. So because actually Kant is what is produced or developed, really transcendental sense of rationality. That is exactly Deleuze criticized. But yeah, if you allow me actually to kind of audacious, the presupposition, I would say that Deleuze would be Hegelian without the dialectic. You know, he actually replaced actually the dialectic with repetition. And then he took the Hegelian concept of becoming, and he took the Hegelian concept, the difference, but he simply reversed, the Hegel. You know, that means actually that is what exactly the Plato no, sorry, actually the Badiou pointed out. The Deleuze, you are actually reverse the Platonism, and then Deleuze accept that one. So university, university actually, the univocal multiplicity, the concept as such is really, really actually, the Hegelian concept is a reverse the Hegelianism there. That's why actually the enemy is a good reader of your work. The Badiou is really, really nice, the reader of the Deleuze, in my opinion. That's why he pointed out that your real master is a Bergson. That is a real, real actually powerful, the conclusion of, actually the Deleuzian philosophy. And then I followed actually Badiou's critique of the Deleuze in this sense, and then also the Gangdeng Meyers said the Deleuze is Hegelian, something like that. That means actually Deleuze didn't give up Hegelianism, and then he didn't give up the Lukács, that kind of Marxism. He didn't give up. He simply reversed it. He tried to actually use it for his own intellectual experiment. That is for him philosophy. That's why he talked about the apprenticeship. He actually use the philosopher to what? To discuss the future. That's why actually what Deleuze talk about is a line of light. Definitely only way we can create a future. So how can you create a future? You must invent people to come. That is actually philosophy's task. Only way, that means as Deleuze talk about that, only the three actually the discipline could or some genre, whatever called, the way the could create the future against present. Present is, according to Deleuze, is a continuation of past. It's a very Humean idea. Is David Hume said, it's just the one is definitely habit, your habitual perception. But only the event could bring in this kind of future. But the science and the philosophy and art, science would use actually what is the number or something like that, all right? And then art would use some image or figure, the metaphor, and then this or some sense, and then the philosophy is concept. So you should actually create your own concept, and the concept is really the delusion, the sense of concept really Marxist, the Marx, the sense of concept is Marx thought, the against the Max Weber, and that means actually the kind of sociological, the trend. He talk about, the Begriff is a concept in, the German is kind of the battlefield. All right, you should actually take over your own ideas through this battle. So as for the Marx, the concept means better. And then, in my opinion, I found very similarity, in Deleuze actually Deleuze definition of the concept. So creation of concept in this sense really, really actually interesting one. So you should actually create a concept. You should do everything for the the revolution. You shouldn't organize people. You couldn't do that because people would organize you. People already organized by what this the system. Like cybernetic. That's why actually cybernetic is very influential on the later Deleuze. So actually this capitalism and then this the modern society already organized people.
Yeah, I think it's very powerful for the critique of an overthrow of regimes of discipline, control, and representation.
Mm.
And however, I wonder at times to what extent politically, again, it brings us back into this question of how we methodically apply these concepts to political fields. I wanted to actually ask you also about this notion related to this of the idea of time and Bergson and
Mhm.
duration. In Lukács' Destruction of Reason, as you know,
Mhm.
all of vitalism is sort of seen as complicit with the right
Sure. Mm.
epistemologically. After all, we know that Mussolini was deeply influenced by Bergson's notion of duration. And of course, for folks that don't know, even with Sorel,
Mhm.
Sorel
Yeah.
in a myth of violence, he had a Bergsonian conception of the revolution as breaking from
Yeah.
certain regimented forms of
Mhm.
time.
Mhm.
That's extremely powerful idea. And when you apply it to revolutionary thought, one can see all of these points of resonance.
Mhm.
How do you think about this vis-a-vis Deleuze's conception of the creation of the people, third worldism, and even you talk about how the category even of dictatorship of proletariat
Mhm.
can be rethought, which I find very interesting because, you know, it's the one category which probably is seen to be most um, anti-Deleuzian
Mhm.
because it's about organization, it's about the sublation. It's, I think, in some sense, it's deeply Hegelian because it relies on the two negations
Mhm.
from Paris Commune.
Yeah. Negation of negation. Yeah.
It relies on it,
Mm.
in my view. So, can you have an anti-Hegelian conception of dictatorship of proletariat?
Mhm.
That's very challenging to even begin to think. You know what I mean? Because
Yeah.
again,
Yeah. That is very interesting question because the Deleuze Guattari never said. That actually the sorry, that debate emerged. You know the after that the some revisionism it became quite dominant in the Euro Marxism, something like that, right? Some Euro communism.
Eurocommunism,
Yeah,
yeah,
Althusser was really, really critical of that.
sure.
And then point is that his point was that we must defend the dictatorship of proletariat. But Deleuze and Guattari, in particular, Deleuze never, said we must give up, we must abolish dictatorship of proletariat. And then rather, he talked about we should reinvent universal proletariat. You know, what does that mean? So of course, actually, they had weakest point when they discussed this one, as you pointed quite correctly. How can we apply this idea for the real actually the activity? How can we apply for let people organize themselves and then but we can find out lots of what is a example the people practice their own activity like what happened in the today's Gaza, all right. Greta Thunberg, does she have some party? why why does she actually do that? Actually, even one Korean girl, the went to the the boat. She was there, but she was not reported on the any the newspaper,
Mm.
any the actually the Western media, but she was there. Just like that, she might be as the people who are missing, there. That means we don't know actually who are there, but that is missing people. But that is what I mean. Actually, the people doing something, and then why actually the people doing something? In my opinion, that is the idea of communism. They simply have might be quite sound naive. Actually, Trump said, people are quite naive, and then they actually will sacrifice themselves for the idea. But that is what the Deleuze, pointed out, you know. It seems a little bit stupid, but thing is that people act according to that kind of stupidity, that pure stupidity, not the quite different from the Trump stupidity. All right. So I think that this is really, that's why it really actually as a academic in the university and then intellectuals or some journalists, we are really powerless. We feel like we are quite powerless. All right. But Deleuze didn't say it. We are powerless, and we must actually fall into the pessimism.
Hmm.
Quite unlike Foucault. Foucault simply retreated to the the analysis of liberalism, and then he just developed just very interesting concept there, but he didn't really actually engage that kind of activity. For instance, he kept silence about Israel,
Yeah.
but the Deleuze really openly supported Palestine.
Yeah.
You know?
Again, this kind of goes back to my first question about the stages of Deleuze, because he ends his career with the intention before he dies to write a book which would be entitled On the
Mm.
Grandeur of Marx, which is
Mm.
fascinating.
Mm.
And in an interview with Bernard Stiegler, which I cite in my work, which
Mm.
you read,
Yeah, yeah.
he says something that I affirmed, which I just want everyone to remember, that the anti-Oedipus series was appropriated by liberalism. And
Uh,
Deleuze
mm.
calls that himself. He says that himself. You see, so he himself cuts his work in relationship to the
Mhm.
rise of neoliberalism itself. And I
Sure.
think that he prophetically shows that maybe we should be careful when we read the Anti-Oedipus series and think about these questions of liberalism itself. Final question. I know it's getting late, and I thank you so much for this brilliant exchange. Okay. What what would have been the grandeur of Marx,
Mhm.
do you think? What might it have looked like
Mm.
as a text? Do you have any premonition on this idea?
There was a clue, about that book. Actually, yeah, I don't know actually that he wrote anything about the grandeur of Marx, but even, Antonio Negri, insists he saw that manuscript. I don't know actually whether he got that, information, but he wrote, the article about Yasser Arafat is a Palestine. That is a greatness, grandeur of Yasser Arafat. I think that is clue, so which we would understand, why did the Deleuze intend to write book about Marx when the that Soviet Union, Soviet bloc collapsed, and then that's what actually my actually the understanding is related to the Jacques Derrida spectrum of Marx. Spectrum of Marx is a ontology or something like that. But in my opinion, is the Deleuze Marx will be more ontological rather than the hermeneutic or phenomenology. It's more like ontological, more, in my opinion, closer to Lukács' unfinished work. But Lukács thought labor is a universal condition of life. But in my opinion, the Deleuze would have a different idea. It's immanence. That's why actually his last work was about the life a immanence, and the life is universal. And then he tried to actually, in my opinion, is the concretize, the ontological. What is the ontological dimension of life? Life is shared by all humanity. So he didn't go to that kind of rationalism. I told you that because he always talked about relation between subject and object without the dialectic. And
Mm.
that's why he said, really is strangely, stones think. Stones think. But it's not actually naturally, it's not, the post-humanism, it's not actually, the object-oriented ontology. How the stone thinks, because stone is part of our thinking. Thinking is only for the human being, but without this stone, without this circumstance, without interdependency, it's kind of cosmic relation, as Bergson said. If you drink any water, you need what? Gravity. You need actually the H2O ingredient in the cosmic relation. You must have Earth, something like that. So this is what the Bergson described in terms of cosmic relation, for your existence. And then Deleuze extended this idea to understand is a political dimension of life. I think because if you actually read Marx through this angle of the Deleuzian, the interpretation, you would find out really, really interesting, the discussion there. For instance, Marx, the discussion of machinery. Machinery really, really actually the Spinozist, the discussion there, and then that means actually the Deleuze would actually um, reread actually the Marx, from the perspective of this kind of some ontology. And then, yeah, the unfinished work, but anyway, just we could actually find out that kind of clue, the sparse, in sparse way, and then the Weber, the finished works.
Wow. Well, this has probably come the closest that I've ever had to a relationship to Deleuze, which is copacetic with my vision, even though I'm very cautious given the propensity of the extremist, anarchist, liberal reading of Deleuze and the cruelty that they bring out, which is deeply unfortunate and very classed. But it's very nice to talk to you about Deleuze, who, without question, I think is one of the most important philosophers of 20th century. The question for us is his relationship to Marx and to communism. We've really, I think, had some very interesting breakthroughs. The connection to Lukács, the connection to a reading of Deleuze that's Hegelian, without the dialectic, without negation. Which actually there is a book by a scholar, University of Chicago, that tries to re-propose the phenomenology vis-a-vis Deleuze. I forget his name. An interesting figure. Does that ring a bell to you?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So, yeah, I don't remember his name, but I came across that work. Yeah.
So you write a lot beyond Deleuze too. Can you just tell us a little about your other work and what you're working on in the future?
Yeah. Now I'm working on the AI, and from the perspective of Lacan, Jacques Lacan, is because in my opinion, Jacques Lacan is a very precursor to discuss cybernetic. So his work, that means against Freudian, the thermodynamic, the Lacan developed, the cybernetic, the concept of unconscious. And then I'm writing on that. It's gonna be published by the series, the one of the series organized by the Ian Parker.
Excellent.
And by the
symbolic.
But actually, my actual theory is more focused on the later Lacan, when he abolished the early, theory. After his visit to Japan, he changed his theory, and then he also abolished the concept of unconscious, and then emphasizing the Jusaks. All right.
Yeah, the parlet and the notion of the. So you get into his theory of knots.
Yeah, sure. And then knots, and then of course his the theory of psychosis, and then in my opinion that would give us a way to understand or some to resist this AI, the gilded eye, the cage. So there's a way in which I'm doing to analyze the AI, the logic of AI. And then another one is a weak technology is one of my books about technology, and then it's a political dimension. So weak technology is more related to the Deleuze concept of minor communism. So I try to develop, this my own idea of minor communism. So gonna be come up next year, I hopefully.
That's brilliant. I want to follow up a conversation on this because we did not talk about the category of minority struggles that Deleuze and Guattari bring out. I would be very excited to read this, and I'd love to chat with you about it. Just want to thank everyone for a very spirited chat and for listening to this conversation. Thank you guys so much. Alex, we'll let you retire for the night.
This is a big honor for me, and then I really loved your work, Daniel, and then I'm really happy to have you and then as my comrade. So
Thank you so much. All the best, everyone.
thank
Take care.
you.